654 of the Church Bible. Again, that's Jonah chapter 1, verses 17 to chapter 2, verses 10. But the Jonah provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, but you listened to my cry, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever, but you brought my life up from the pit. O Lord my God, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs, but I, with the song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. This is the word of the Lord, and now we invite Pastor Aaron to give us today's message.
Thanks, Jen. How are we? All right. So last week we began a new series going through the book of Jonah. And as we delve into Jonah, we found him to be a three-dimensional character who's a lot like us. As God had called him to go to Nineveh to preach repentance, he found it very, very hard to follow after God because those are the enemies. And no matter how hard he tried, he wrestled with this burden to obey on one hand, but yet also rebelling on the other, because there was nothing within him that could love those people. Now, for us, we are like Jonah, because there are often times where we know what we're supposed to do, but everything within us screams the opposite. But in his mercy, God allows us to try to go our own way, just like Jonah, heading in the opposite direction, away from Nineveh. But God, in his grace, never lets go. For Jonah's case, he encountered that storm that ultimately led him to be thrown overboard, where he ends up, as we just read, to be swallowed by a big fish. Now, in the end, we never outrun God. But that's the beauty of the gospel, that he hunts us down. He pursues us, not to enslave us, but to set us free for our good. Now, as we jump into chapter 2 of Jonah, what we're going to see here is, in the midst of this narrative, there's a break at this crucial point. Right when Jonah is swallowed, we have this chapter in chapter 2 in which Jonah prays this makeshift prayer psalm from inside the great fish. And what we see here is, from this prayer, is in this time, when he's within the belly of the giant fish, it becomes this sort of epiphany for Jonah. It's this moment when Jonah finally recognizes and realizes how, on his own, he has dragged himself down and down and down into the depths. But it's also in this moment in which he sees the unmerited favor of the Lord in providing him with rescue and salvation. And in the same way for us, as we look at this, we see that left to our own devices, our natural tendency is to lead us down into the depths. But yet, in God's goodness and grace, he lifts us up. Now, much has been made about Jonah and the big fish. And today we're going to take a bit of I think in academic circles they call this an excursus, but in, I think, normal, everyday talk, we call this a rabbit trail. And we're going to talk about how Jonah is a historical, is not really moving, how Jonah is actually a historical account, right? Jonah is a historical account. Much has been written about Jonah and the big fish. And then in many different ways, people have tried to explain it and say, this is how it's supposed to work, this has happened. There's one paper that cited a man who had been, another man outside of Jonah, who had been swallowed by a whale and lived to tell about it, right? This work was a little shady because, that there were contrary stories where the wife was like, no, that never happened, someone made it up. But someone tried to explain it. Others have seen this and said, this is so ridiculous. How can this ever have happened? And so instead, in order to make this a work in the Bible that seems semi-plausible, they have said that this is a literary fiction, an allegory for us, a myth that we ought not consider to be real. Oh, it works now? Thanks, Stephen. Okay, let me try. You lied. Oh no, you know what it is? Yeah, it works. You didn't lie. I lied. Yes, on video. Okay. So, where was I up to? So some have called it a literary fiction, a myth, that it wasn't real. It never happened. Still others have gone and performed like different types of hermeneutical gymnastics in trying to explain it. This is my favorite. By favorite, I mean least favorite, right? So this one guy says, actually, after he got thrown overboard, he actually floated back to shore. And when he got to shore, he stayed at this inn called the Big Fish, right? in which he recovered and he saw the Lord's grace at work. Now, in the words of Charles Barkley, that's terrible. Just terrible. We can't believe that anyone would try to explain it in that way. Now, what is wrong with viewing it, though, as literary fiction? I'll tell you what's wrong. Jonah, throughout the Bible, has been viewed as a historical account. In fact, Jesus himself in Matthew 12, 38 to 40, in Matthew 16, verses 1 to 4, Jesus himself, at these two times, were asked to give a miraculous sign as proof of his divinity, that he's God. So his response at that point in time is that no sign will be given except for the sign of Jonah. And this is what he says, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Now, if Jonah is historical fiction, only meaningful but not actually factual, then it makes for a pretty lame sign. Right? Jesus is saying, hey, take this pretend sign and I'll kind of happen to die and resurrect in a similar pretend sort of way. That's not really how Jesus interprets Jonah. Jesus sees this as a fact, something that actually happens. Now for us, when we think about this issue of Jonah and being swallowed by a big fish, what we really are asking, it comes down to this basic question that, are miracles possible? Are miracles possible? Now, for many of us, I'm going to take this brief time to talk about this. For many of us, we have taken on this naturalistic worldview, which sees our world as a closed system, right? Where there are natural laws that govern the earth, and nothing can violate and change that. Now, the Christian worldview, in many ways, is similar to the naturalistic worldview, except for this. We believe that there are natural laws that govern the earth, but yet there's also a creator of the universe that has put all these laws into place and who can also reach down into the system and transcend those laws. So to put it in the way that Peter Kreeft puts it, right? Sometimes we say, hey, doesn't that violate the natural laws? Peter Kreeft says it like this. To say that God is violating natural law, it's kind of like saying the principal of a school is violating the schedule in his school when he decides to make a change. We wouldn't say the principal is breaking rules in doing that. What we would say is the principal decided to modify the schedule. And in a similar sort of way, what God is doing when he acts in a miraculous work is he's not breaking any kind of rule, but he, as the creator of all the laws that govern humanity and govern the earth, he's decided to transcend, supersede, to modify for only a moment so that a miracle could be possible. Now, others may ask, hey, miracles just don't seem that scientific. What about the scientific method? Hasn't science proven that miracles are not possible? And if you think of it this way, we need to explain how the scientific method works and how miracles work. I think it is Alan Scholes who illustrates it this way. Imagine, right, that you're in a chemistry lab. And when you're in chemistry lab, you get opportunities to mix different chemicals together. Let's say you mix this blue chemical with this colorless clear chemical, and when you mix it together, there's a mild reaction that takes place. It gets cloudy, and then a green precipitates out, right? Do it 100 times, that always happens. Let's say one night you decide to go into this chemistry lab, like breaking in, right? I don't know why you do that, but let's just say you did that all by yourself. You're in there, and you mix these same two chemicals, the blue one with the colorless one that's clear, and then when you mix it, kaboom, right? The smoke happens, and then once the smoke clears, there's this yellowy substance that precipitates out at the bottom. You go and you have it tested, and you find out this is real gold. Now, what will be the next thing that happens for you? Most likely, my guess is most of you would try to repeat it, right? To see, hey, how much gold can I make out of this? But let's just say you were to try it again. And when you mix the two together, a green precipitates out. But not gold. But not gold. What would you do then? Would you go into the scientific community and say, hey, I was able to create gold out of these two chemicals? My guess is no. You probably wouldn't, right? Because it's not repeatable. 100 times you do it, 100 times it turns out to be green stuff, not gold, except for that one time. You would be the laughingstock of the scientific community if you tried to write a paper based on that. Let's just say in that one moment when gold happened, God had decided that he was going to perform that miracle so that it would be gold. It's not repeatable. It was just God, through his sovereign plan, decided to act in that certain sort of way so that it would be changed. Scientific methods cannot explain a miracle happening, nor can it disprove a miracle happening, because scientific method is meant to show us that this thing is repeated, and every time you do it, it's the same sort of thing. But a miracle by nature is not going to be repeatable readily. But when we think about miraculous acts of God, there's something else that we ought to think of. It's more similar to a historical event that takes place than it is to a lab experiment that happens. Say, consider one historical event. Let's say the Boston Tea Party, right? When we go and say the Boston Tea Party was an actual event that took place, nobody goes and tries to prove it through the scientific method. How do people say that the Boston Tea Party actually happened? We'll say there were actual eyewitnesses that were there that can testify, and that said a lot of tea was dumped into the Boston Harbor, and different people will have written about it. So in the case of Jonah, the people that wrote about it was most likely Jonah or the person that Jonah told. And the people that witnessed what had happened were the sailors that threw him over, as well as the Ninevites who saw him alive after that had taken place. Now, to broaden this out, right, not just with the miracle of Jonah, but let's say with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. As we consider the resurrection, we realize that this was something that happened that wasn't done in secret, but yet not only did the disciples see it, but 500 other witnesses were able to not only say, this was something I saw Jesus after he was crucified, after he was buried in the tomb. He was there. I touched him. People who, when Christ had died, had scattered like cockroaches. Well, cockroach is not a good word. But like scattered and were so scared for their own lives. But yet, after the resurrection, were willing to lay down their lives and all but one of the apostles died a martyr's death. When we think about miracles, we realize that they're meant to be proved through the faithful eyewitnesses that were there. For Jonah, he doesn't actually make a big stink about it. But the very fact that Jonah is written in a way that is not very flattering for Jonah is a bit of an evidence for us to see that, hey, perhaps this was written because it actually happened. Perhaps this was written to make much of God, because God was the one who not only saw Jonah rebel, but brought him back when he went down into the depths. Now, after that big rabbit trail, let's jump into our text itself. Because in this chapter 2, what I hope for us to come away from through this prayer is that oftentimes in our own lives, for one reason or another, we may end up in the depths. But it's not the end of us. It's actually the beginning of life for us. So, if you will, turn to Jonah chapter 2 as we look at Jonah together. Read with me verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2. Now, after Jonah was inside the big fish, he says in chapter 2, verse 1, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. And he said, verse 2, in my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Now, in this little passage here, it becomes the framework in understanding what has happened to Jonah. Jonah is saying here that on his own, his tendency has let him down deep into the depths. But yet, that wasn't the end. That as he cried out, the Lord came and he answered. It's very interesting how it turns out here. He says it twice, right? The first time, in my distress I called to the Lord and he answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Very common poetry in Hebrew literature, a parallelism. The second part where he says, from the depths of the grave, you see a little footnote there that says, that actually says it can otherwise be translated as Sheol. Sheol now, it can refer to the grave, but it was also the place where the wicked awaited the judgment of God, in which God was going to judge, and they were forever going to be separated. So as Jonah is talking about this, what he feared was a death in two senses. One, a physical death, because of where he had ended up. But two, most likely, he feared this spiritual death, this separation from the Lord. As it continues on in verses 3 to 6, it says, you hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. Here, in a physical sort of way, this was happening in his life. How he had been thrown overboard, how he was sinking into the sea. But yet, in a spiritual sort of way, this was also happening as well. That his sin, his rebellion, had led him to spiral down out of control into the depths. Verse 4 says, I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. Here, what we see is the use of direction. It's very interesting because throughout the book of Jonah, you see this use of direction is highly symbolic. As the rebellious actions of Jonah happened, it brought him down. First, it brought him down to Joppa. Then it brought him down below the deck of the ship. Then he was hurled into the deep. And now, as we read it, he has sunken all the way to the roots of the mountain. As Stephen Ram puts it, God is giving us a lesson in spiritual geography. Left to our own devices, we will go down. It's the story of the church. It's the story of Israel. It's our story as well. There's this natural tendency that happens that will lead us into the depths. When we start to follow after sin, when we start to follow after rebellion, things start to unravel and life falls apart. I remember when I was very young, one of my cousins was kind of like a bad kid, right? Like every family has at least one bad kid, right? Like a black sheep. So this cousin, he wasn't super bad, but kind of bad. So what happened was, I remember he wanted to swindle his mother out of some money. Right? I don't know if you call it that. He just pretty much wanted money. He wanted a way to get it from his mom, but he needed an excuse. So he went, and in Hong Kong, it's private school, so you have to buy your own books, right? So he went and he told his mom, "Mom, I bought all these books, so you need to give me $500, Hong Kong, whatever amount of money it was." So his mom gives him the money. But then, like, she kind of was like, wait, this is a little fishy, So she goes and says, I want to see those books that you bought. So now he has to produce these extra books that he has just made up. So he goes to another one of my cousins, right, and says, yo, lend me some textbooks that you got. So he goes, and he takes those textbooks to his mom. And she's like, okay. But then, the relatives start talking, and then they start seeing these are mighty similar textbooks. So they start to say, hey, I want both of you guys to show me your textbooks at once. And finally, that's when the web of lies kind of unravels, and then my cousin realized that he was trapped, and he had to fess up. Now, in our day now, we have like Elf on the Shelf, to help kids behave during Christmas time. Back then, it was a belt on a shelf to keep you in line. So he got it at that point in time. He knew that he had messed up, and he had to pay for it. Now, my point is, I'm sure all of us, in one way or another, has had an experience, maybe not exactly like that, but similar, in which we said we're just going to make this little lie, but then it spun out of control, beyond anything that we can do. And it led us into the depths. And that's a spiritual truth, that on our own, our tendency leads us down into the depths. And for Jonah, it certainly did that. That because of his unwillingness to follow after God, he ended up being thrown overboard and then in the belly of the big fish. For Jonah, though, this big fish moment should not have been seen as a death to him or a curse to him, but actually a blessing. Read verses 8 to 10 with me. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with the song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. If he had not hit rock bottom, if he had not been swallowed by that big fish, then he may never have realized just how far he had gone away from the Lord. Sometimes for us, in living in America or living anywhere, we feel like, success is the only option. That if we experience failure, that's got to be a terrible thing. That's got to have no real meaning. So we chase after success time after time. But yet, for us, as it was for Jonah, the big fish moment is a blessing and not a curse. And God uses it. There's this story. There's a story in Chinese, I don't know if it's literature or whatever, but Chinese people tell the story, and the saying goes like this. It's called "Choi Yong Satma Yin Ji Fei Fok." Right? Most of you have no idea what I just said, and it's okay. Right? But let me explain this. So there's this guy. His name is Mr. Choi. Right? Now, Mr. Choi once had this beautiful, beautiful stallion, this horse. But yet, one day, the horse runs away. And everyone goes up to Mr. Choi and says, "Mr. Choi, we're so sorry. That is such a great loss that you lost the horse." And Mr. Choi is like, well, it might not be the worst thing in the world. And lo and behold, before you know it, the horse comes back. But when it comes back, it doesn't just come back. It brings along with it a whole host of wild horses. And everyone says to Mr. Choi, Mr. Choi, you are so blessed. That is such an amazing thing. Not only do you have your horse back, but you have all these other horses back as well. And Mr. Choi said, it may not be such a great thing after all. But before you know it, what he says comes true. Because one day when Mr. Choi's son is riding one of those horses that had come back with the first horse, he falls off and he breaks his leg. And again, the people come up to him and say, Mr. Choi, we feel so bad. This is a terrible thing. No good could come out of it. And again, as you know the pattern, he says, maybe it's not so bad. And before you know it, a war breaks out in China. And because Mr. Choi's son has a broken leg, he's unable to participate in the war. As we hear the story and the twists and the turns that take place, the point of it is that sometimes failures and sometimes the bad things that happen in life are blessings in disguise. From a biblical worldview, a Christian worldview, what God may be doing is sometimes He takes those failures and the hard times really not to destroy you, but ultimately for your good. And those big fish moments for Jonah and for us are these times when God gets our attention, so we ought to pay attention. There's a guy by the name of Don Miller. I don't know, have you heard of him? He wrote this book called Blue Like Jazz, right? And it was a very famous book. Shortly after the book was written, some movie producers come up to him and they said to him, Don, we want to make a movie based on your life. And we want to spend some time with you so we can work on this movie, we can also observe your life. But as they started observing his life and living with him and crafting this movie together, they started editing his life. And as they started doing that, it was very painful for him because he had thought to himself, hey, I've lived a pretty interesting life. I've written a memoir of my life, Blue Like Jazz, and yet, are you saying to me that my life really isn't good enough to be made into a movie? And at that moment, something dawned on him. After the ridiculous success that he experienced from Blue Like Jazz, he kind of fell into life, right? Where his pattern became, this guy that would go and drink good coffee, that would hang out. But what he realized was that he wasn't living a very good story. And it took the shaking up of the making of a movie and people telling him, you're not living a very good story, for him to realize that something needed to change about his life. And in many ways, for us, there are these big fish moments that come our way. Things that we never would have wanted or asked for, but yet shake us up enough so that we start to pay attention and realize that God may be doing something else. For me, I wouldn't call it a big fish moment. I guess you can call it a little fish moment, right? Shortly after I became a Christian. Now, to give you a little bit of a context, right? All throughout my life, I felt like, there's certain things you base your identity on. And for me, I think I may have told you this before, I based my identity on my intelligence, feeling like I was pretty smart, right? One of the things that validated it was when I was in 4th grade. In our town, we have this thing called the Program for the Academically Gifted, right? PAG. It used to be called PIG, but the Program for the Intellectually Gifted, but then too many people made fun of us. So then they changed it to PAG, right? And when that happened, it became this thing for me that made me feel like, man, I'm special. Right? And you would get fed this thing hey, you're a gifted kid, you're smart, you're going to do something with your life. And many of my friends who are in the program actually did. I just recently met up with a bunch of my friends. I think I told some of you, one of my friends has gone on to open up a board game company. Have you heard of Wits and Wagers? Right? He just told me, they just sold their 1 millionth copy, right? And that was pretty cool. Another guy who I was very good friends with is in private equity. Another guy is making 3D printing. Are you guys from cutting edge of 3D printing? Still another guy opened up a movie production company. No, a media production company where this is pretty funny. He makes he edits Sports Illustrated swimsuit from 30 hours to an hour and a half. We all said, what a poor guy. Feel so bad for him. But in any case, everyone did like very special things and whatnot. And that was the thought that we would all do something wonderful. Now, you fast forward out to around senior year, and I had my eyes set on this one school that I had wanted to go to. My sister had gone to that school. It made my parents very proud. I felt like, I want to make my parents proud. I want to go to this school. And so I said, early decision, this is the one school that I really want to go to and be a part of. But I still remember the day when I got the letter back. I was in the back of my parents' minivan, and my sister told me, Aaron, the letter came back. And then I asked her, I was like, is it thick or is it thin? Right? Because and she's like, it's kind of thin. I was like, and then I'm very optimistic, so I'm like, oh yeah, maybe they'll send the details later. They're just like, good job, guy. Don't go anywhere. We got you, right? But then she opened it, and she's like, no, you got it rejected. I was like, what? Are you sure it said rejected? And she's like, yeah, rejected. And then when I went home, I read it again and again and again. I didn't even get waitlisted. It was a flat-out rejection. You're not competitive enough. Don't call us ever. Bye. It wasn't quite worded that way, but that's how it felt to me, right? And for me, I was devastated. I had built my entire life feeling like, hey, once I go to school, then I'm going to be this, then I'm going to be that, and I'm going to do dope stuff, right? Like, that was set. But yet, I had no idea what I was going to do next. And I was still hanging on to that dream. I remember that I didn't really care. I said, there's some safety school I applied to, and I'm just going to go to one of them, and I'm going to transfer out after a year, and continue on the dream. But then that led me to the University of Buffalo, which is a good school. I don't want to knock it. I know some of you go there, so I don't want you guys to feel bad about or hate me, right? So I went there expecting to transfer out soon. But yet, one of the amazing things that happened was God did something. That became this place where I found this wonderful church community. That also became this place where there was this guy that came alongside me and discipled me and mentored me and showed me how to become a Christian man. And I don't know what would have happened if I had gone to my dream school. But I know that God had brought me to Buffalo in order to not devastate me or break me and ruin all of my dreams, but yet because He had other things in store. And I share all this because I want to say that the big fish moments in our lives are blessings, not curses. God doesn't put things into our way to destroy us, but actually because He has something more for us. And the truth is, when we cry out to the Lord, He lifts us up. One of the things that happen in our Christian lives is sometimes, if we're like Jonah, we might go astray, we might rebel, do whatever. But yet, once we rebel, we feel like we're so far from God that we're beyond redemption. And that's the great lie of the enemy, isn't it? The 1-2 punches, the devil gets you to sin and then says, how can you go back to God after you've done all this? You're not worthy. But brothers and sisters, the truth is that no sin is so great that God can't rescue. And the big fish moment is a Christian paradox. It shows us that time and time again, that loss is gain in the Christian economy. That when I'm weak, then He's strong. That God brings brokenness into our lives to reveal to us that we weren't made to live this life apart from Him, but to live in the center of His plan. What might be your big fish moment right now? For some of you, you're facing adversity. For some, maybe you're dealing with some sickness, or maybe it's a sickness that your family is wrestling with. For others, it might be a difficulty at work. Still others, you might be feeling some sort of relational conflict with close friends, with family, whatever it may be. But may we, like Jonah, be able to say, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and He answered me. Let's go to the Lord together. Our Father in heaven, we confess that there are often times when we wander and we rebel or we go our own way. And like Jonah, we end up in the depths. But yet we pray that when those big fish moments come, when maybe we built ourselves up or we placed our hope in something other than you, that we realize you bring it for our redemption and not for our destruction. Help us to learn to turn to you time and time again, to realize that you are a God who loves us and who gives us second chances, third chances, fourth chances, who never gives up on us, and that we're in the best place ever when we're in the center of your will. So help us to lean on you. May we learn to cry out to you and know that you're the one who comes to our rescue. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.